Hi, hello everyone. My name is Hadil, and today we're going to talk about volume, or as I want to call it, voluminous clouds. Every time you see clouds-like textures in my projects or in my videos, it's probably this technique. It's nothing special, it's very simple, and you can create it with any object you have on the scene. But I'm going to show you how I use it to create clouds like this and like this. To me, it looks more like cotton or cotton candy than actual clouds, but I still like the look of it. Okay, so how I started is create the shape of the cloud or the form of the cloud. And there are multiple ways you can create this. You can use meta balls because it creates that mushy look already and it makes things much easier for you. But I also like to combine a bunch of objects and then just remesh them. So what I do is go to mesh, and as always, I like to use the round cube. And I always make its radius at 1, and then I start shaping the cloud. So if I just move this over here, and then I duplicate everything in edit mode, so the entire form is just one mesh, instead of just creating it and then joining it. It's just much easier for me to do it in edit mode. So I already have one mesh. And I just hit Shift D and duplicate it. And I make some of them smaller and some of them bigger. And then I move some of them to the front a bit and some I just move to the back, simply creating the form of a cloud. And I'm selecting the objects by clicking L when I hover over one of the objects, but I deselect everything first, so I make sure that I'm selecting just one object. And it's going to select any of the objects that are not connected. I'll right-click it, Shade Smooth, so it's smoother. And then I add a subdivision surface, or first I try to remesh it. If it doesn't work, then I'll just add the subdivision. And I hold Shift while changing the voxel size. And I try to kind of ruin the form of the original object, so it's combined a little bit. And then check, or you can, instead of checking in object mode, you can just turn on the edit mode preview. And this way you can actually see how it's looking. And let's make sure smooth shading is on so you can actually see how the form is looking. I don't care too much about how it looks right now because changing it later in the shader editor is going to allow me to see how the cloud is going to look like and if I need to adjust the actual base form of it. Okay, we have some type of cloud. And then I go to shading and I add a new material, but instead of having principled BSDF, I can just delete this one and add a principled volume. And instead of connecting it to the surface, I can connect it to the volume. And if I go into render preview, you'll see something completely different. I also like to remove outline selected so I don't see that orange selection edge. Okay, and now let's play with this material. So the first thing I change is the color. If you want it to look a little bit more natural, then I would leave the default color, but I like to play around with color because I'm not always looking for realism when it comes to my work. It's more stylized than realistic. So I like to warm it up a little and create something that you would see in a sunset, I guess. And if you want to play around with it even more, you can add a Voronoi texture or a noise texture to the color. So if I plot this into the color, you're going to see that it's going to take the noise color. And if you want to preview these textures, you can definitely just connect it to the surface, or if you have Node Wrangler turned on, then you can just hit Control Shift and click on it. And it'll show you the first output. And if you click on it again, then it's going to show you the second output. Clicking on it while still holding Control Shift, by the way. But if you want to see it in volume form, then you have to remove it from surface. And you can also, instead of just putting the color in directly, you can add a color ramp. Change the colors over here. And let's preview this to see how it looks. And then I like to copy the first color that I created, paste it in the second color, or actually the second color, paste it in the first color, whatever. And then make one of them a little bit darker to create variations in the color itself. In this way, I can input this color into this color, and I can just remove this so you can see it in volume form. This is already really cool. So if you've created a better base form for your cloud, then it's going to look much better than mine. However, what I do is add displacement. So that's the second thing I do when it comes to volume. Let's add Shift A and then search for displacement. Input this into the displacement. And like any displacement, this will require a well subdivided mesh, but because we have remeshed this, it's going to work fine. And then I can add a noise texture with a color ramp to increase the contrast and the brightness of our clouds. Add some variations to this displacement and then input this into the height. And this will create displacement, but it's not going to work again until we turn on in the material settings the displacement and bump displacement. And then I will reduce this to, let's say, 0.5. And then I can remove the preview over here so you can see it. And this is already much, much better. Let's add a background, rotate it on the x-axis at 90 degrees. This is what I do all the time when I want to create a background for my objects, and then take it back on the y-axis since I'm always on the x and y axis for the floor, and then up and down is the z-axis because I'm always in front view. And then I can increase the size of this background just until it covers the camera. And then let's add a material for it. Let's make it darker. And you can definitely play around with the displacement and add other textures. So I do build on top of the noise texture. I do add a Voronoi texture sometimes, scale it up a little bit, and then also add a color ramp to change the contrast and brightness of this texture. Whatever is black is going to go inside, and whatever is white is going to blow outward. So that's how displacement works. Black goes in, white goes out. And let's multiply these two textures. Or actually, let's see this first alone and see how it looks without the preview. So it gave little bits of variations here and there. Now I can multiply both of these and input this into the height. If I preview this multiplication, it's going to add the blacks on top of each other. So the noise is at the bottom, which is what these gray areas are, and then these bigger dots are the Voronoi texture. For a more technical explanation of the multiplication of two textures, when I said in textures and materials that 0 is black and 1 is white, this is doing the multiplication in terms of numbers as well. So 0 multiplied by 0 equals 0, so more black. And 1 multiplied by 1 equals more white, but then 1 multiplied by 0 is going to give us black. But it's not necessarily only zeros and whites because this is grayscale, so it goes from 0 to 1. And it multiplies based on that, and that resulting color is the representation of that number that resulted from that multiplication. And it's a vector because these are colors, so RGB values. But because we're working with grayscale, R, G, and B, which is red, green, and blue, are all the same number. And that creates one scale of colors from 0 to 1. So if I preview them alone, then this texture is the noise, and then these are the Voronoi texture, and this is the multiplication of the two. And they're added to the height for the displacement. And if I remove this from the surface so we can actually see the volume, this is what we get. So again, even though my base form isn't that great, this already looks like a cloud. So you can stop here, but what I do sometimes is add some density to it. I can go up to 3, and this is what makes it look more like cotton candy or cotton than clouds. Like in real clouds, the denser the clouds, the darker they are. This does the same exact thing. So if I bring it down to 0.5, you're gonna see that it's a little bit fluffier and has more empty space. So I'll just keep it at 1, but when I'm using this, it's usually on 3 because I'm not necessarily looking for realistic clouds. Honestly, I'm just gonna keep it with the noise. I like it better than multiplying those two. And now if I go into this mesh and I just select or deselect everything and then select one of the objects, I can add more clouds to this. And because everything is happening in the shader node, whatever I add to this object is going to add to this cloud. So this is my usual approach, but sometimes I like to use metaballs just to avoid using the remesh modifier because sometimes it just doesn't work that well with some of my base meshes. You can also play around with other objects that don't really look like clouds and see what you can come up with. And that's pretty much it. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.